Well, greetings, everyone. I am just a minute before start time. Up, there we go, my clock turned. So we'll go ahead and jump in. I'd love to start us out this evening with just a single chime that will allow us to cross over the threshold into what it is that we're doing here. So if you'll just be with me for a moment here, maybe feel your sitting bones on the chair, just really coming present into yourself, into this moment. There is no other moment like this one. And certainly after the year that we've had, and certainly after all the amazing messages that we've heard today. And so letting the sound of this chime just carry you over that threshold into a place that is sacred. And if you're able to feel into yourself in this moment, you'll notice perhaps a slight shift from what was happening before to now as we come together in this place. And I gave a lot of thought to what I wanted to do this evening. First of all, I'm so grateful and honored to be able to be here, and so thankful for Diane and all of her work. She truly is the heart and soul of what's happening here, and she's just tireless and she's amazing. So huge thanks and deep honor really for me to be part of this. And particularly at this hour, I realize that a lot of people will be watching this at a later date. We'll be watching the recording. Some people are already in bed. It's quite late in many places in the country, if not the world right now. But I wanted to really give us an opportunity to drop into something that might not be what we are witnessing in the outer world right now. And that is a place where we can make some meaning of what's happening here. And Jung always, one of my favorite quotes from Jung is when he said, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? And Jung said, that is the telling question of his life. And so for me, as we begin our journey this evening into the soul place, I want to ask you to begin to consider that question for yourself. What is your relationship to something infinite? Do you have one? I guess if you think that you don't have one, that is also a relationship. And so there's a way in which we want to begin to contemplate, how are we related to soul? And soul for me is what gives our lives meaning. So when I first heard maybe the term soul's calling, I always thought, oh, that must be, what I'm going to do with my life, or that's going to be my career, or that's going to be my gifts. And yes, it is all of those things, but it's also so much more, because as we begin to turn our attention to what it is that we're really doing here in our lives and on this planet, there's so much that is required of us to really undertake that journey. And part of that is, of course, listening to our soul self. And Plato, who was a Greek philosopher, of course, who lived about 430 BC, he spoke of a Greek myth, and he says, we were original beings with 4 arms and 4 legs who were split in two by the gods, and we're thereafter always doomed to be searching for our beloved, the missing aspect of ourselves. So this is an idea of us being separated from that something larger, that something infinite. And of course, this also ties into the shamanic perspective of soul loss and the idea that we have lost bits of our souls over the course of our lives that have either fled to the underworld when we were faced with a trauma or a difficult situation that we just didn't know how to handle. And that those pieces now are no longer integrated with us. And so the work that we turn ourselves to in this moment is to be able to begin to call back those lost pieces of ourselves home to ourselves so that we can become more whole. And by the way, this separation is part of the human journey. This is what we're doing here. From the moment that we were born, it began, probably even before. There are a lot of people that have theories around perinatal birth, Stan Grof, who was one of my mentors, being one of those. And that idea that the moment we're born, somebody gives us a name that we didn't necessarily ask for. We're born into a family or a place that we didn't necessarily ask for. We are sent to schools that we didn't have any decision in choosing, and so on and so on. And as we are faced with new situations in our lives that are very difficult, we don't have the opportunity really to do anything except try to survive. And as we develop coping mechanisms that will help us to feel either safe or seen, then those coping mechanisms begin to just pile on top of what our essential, exuberant, innocent, beautiful, precious selves were. And then it is our work to begin to dig out from that for the rest of our lives. So that's what we're doing here. We're digging out. And it's a process that can be very traumatic, but what we want to remember is that our authentic soul self, as I like to call it, is encoded within. There's no getting away from it. We're not separate from it. In fact, we could not be separate from it because it is part of who we already are all the time. And so when I think about leaning into our soul's calling, it's so much about listening so that we can know what we need to do in order to make ourselves more whole. And of course, this is Jung's idea of individuation, right? So, and in fact, by the way, our culture is also based on this whole idea, because if you look at the biblical story of the fall from paradise, you have Adam and Eve who were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, basically, and were no longer in contact with that paradisical being. So here we are. That's such a beautiful illustration of how we have become separated from ourselves. And also it accounts for that longing that we have within to find out who we really are and to be able to be who we really are on this planet. So mythologist Michael Meade, many of you will know him. He talks about separation from our instinctual way of being. And he alludes to the fact that we consider ourselves or feel ourselves sometimes to be exiles. And he says, the soul's way of being is unique to each person. It was seeded and sown within us, within each of us, from before the beginning, and it tries to ripen throughout our lives. What exiles us more than anything is the separation from our own instinctive, intuitive way of being. We are most lost and truly in exile when we have lost touch with our own soul, with our unique inward style and way of being in this world. So all we have to do, and I say that lightly, is we have to come into that knowing that we are part of something so much bigger. We're part of a much, much bigger story. And there's a beautiful myth about the god Indra. And Indra has a net, and that net has all of these nodes. And at each node, you can see all of the other nodes in the net reflected in that one particular node. And so we are all connected and interconnected, woven into the fabric of being. But how do we know this? I kind of find it ironic because a few years ago, I would have been the last person offering a talk on this subject. And yet here I am. And I know now that it was my own soul's calling and my own soul's journey to put me in exactly this chair at exactly this spot in exactly this moment. And also I would suggest that perhaps if you're listening to this, wherever and whenever you are hearing it, that there might also be a reason for that for you too. So I hope that there is a nugget here for you somewhere in it. I wanted to share a little bit about my experience of writing my master's thesis. I did my first master's in depth psychology at Sonoma State University in Northern California. And at the time that I was choosing this subject, there was a new phenomenon that was going on that was quite shocking and alarming, actually. And this was the vanishing of the honeybees by the billions. And it started being reported at the end of 2006. And what was happening was when the beekeepers were lifting the lids on the hives to check on the hives or do routine maintenance, they were discovering that the hives were completely empty, with the exception of the queen and a few of her attendants, and all of the unhatched brood was left behind, but none of the other bees were there. And this was just so shocking. It was not something that anybody could really comprehend. Nobody knew what was happening. And this grabbed my attention to such an extreme degree that I ended up doing a lot of research on it and ended up writing my thesis on it. And what I found from that is that symbolically, it makes so much sense to illustrate what's happening for us here on this planet as human beings on this human journey that we're on. And I know some of you will argue we are actually spiritual beings on that human journey. And of course, I do believe that too. But basically, when the bees were not coming back to the hive, what we understand now is that they were getting lost. They were unable to navigate back home to the hive. And of course, what happens when the bees, the worker bees that go out and get the honey, get the nectar and the pollen to bring it back to make the honey and to feed the hive, when they don't come back, of course, the hive cannot survive. And so the hive ends up collapsing. And it's very interesting because as I started looking into the symbolism of bees, there was so much there. One is that bees are the messengers between realms. So they can fly, in mythology, they are said to be able to fly between heaven and earth. They are the ones that navigate or negotiate between the divine or the sacred or the soul self and the ordinary or the human realm, the realm of the material world. And so already just learning that, I began to make this correlation between what is it that we're doing here? And if the bees aren't coming home, what's happening? What is the metaphor or the archetypal pattern that's at work here? And of course, what we can begin to realize from that is that if we go out from the soul self or our source or that original oneness that existed for all of us, that consciousness before we came into this world of form, as we came into our lives and started separating and going out into the world, we began to feel very alone. We began to forget what it was like to be in the hive. And of course, the hive, you can't get more symbolic than it being the womb. It's the darkness and the life force that's buzzing within that hive. Even the shape of traditional hives is the womb shape, right? So related to the sacred feminine. And what is happening is we have abandoned the sacred feminine largely in our culture. We have forgotten what it means to come back home to the hive and to be consciously bringing back what it is that we are learning and experiencing in our everyday lives as we go out about our daily work. And so for me, the takeaway from all of that was that we absolutely need to be intentionally and consciously connecting with that infinite, with that larger whole. We need to come home to ourselves. And the way that we do that is to be conscious. The way that we do that is to notice, what have I done with my day? What am I doing right now? How am I experiencing what's going on here? And how can I bring that consciousness, that knowledge, that learning back and offer it to the community? Because again, if the bees are caught out alone at night, they cannot return. As night falls, their wings usually get too cold to be able to fly back home. And so we find ourselves lost and we find ourselves suffering. And of course, we all know there's been a lot of suffering going on in the world, particularly this year, but there's always that suffering that's going on. And if you're not suffering, I would say two things. Maybe one is just to feel the gratitude, that your life seems to be going along the way that it is, but also to be able to hold that consciousness for others. And I wanted to share a story about the myth of Inanna. Some of you may have heard of that, but this was the story of a Sumerian goddess who lived about 5,000 years ago. And this myth is one of the first written, if not the first written myth that we have. And in the myth, Inanna, who was called the queen of heaven and earth, she hears something and she's not quite sure what it is. And so she puts her ear to the ground. And when she puts her ear to the ground and really listens, she hears a calling. And that calling is for her to go into the underworld where her dark sister Ereshkigal lives. And Inanna agrees to go. So this is the first step, right? It's listening, and then it's hearing the call. What is being asked of us in this moment? And if we refuse the call or resist the call, of course, there are consequences to that. And many of you know that in shamanic traditions, the shamanic initiate who is called to become a shaman has to actually go to the underworld to be dismembered before being reconstituted so that he can come back with the medicine that he or she needs to be able to serve the community. And so this is basically what happened to Inanna, much to her surprise, as she approached the gates to the underworld and knocked on the gates. What happened was the gates were open to her, but there were 7 gates as she descended down into the underworld. And at each gate, she was asked to give something up. She had to relinquish a piece of jewelry or a piece of clothing, even the crown on her head as the queen of heaven and earth. And she did it, only to find when she reached the underworld itself that she was struck dead and hung on a meat hook. And she was there for 3 days. And I know that some of us can relate to this kind of a descent. And many of us have had many descents, and some of us have had some very, very significant descents when we have felt like maybe there was no way out, that it was never going to get better, or that things were just not possible for us, or that we weren't good enough for certain things, or even good enough for the world. I know that that's a very powerful challenge for a lot of people on this planet. And there are so many opportunities for us to be able to overcome that, but not if we're not listening to the call of soul. Soul is what makes meaning for us. It doesn't mean that we're not going to suffer, but what it does is it makes meaning. And I always tell clients that I work with that, my belief, and you don't have to believe it, but my belief is that we maybe had some say in what we wanted to work on when we came into this world of form. That consciousness, that infinite consciousness that we all are as our true soul selves. Maybe we had some ideas about, some archetypal patterns that we would like to really work on in order to learn and grow. And if we show up here and those opportunities, let's say, start being presented to us to work on ourselves, and we don't take them, we don't consciously apply ourselves and understand this is what I'm doing here, this is what I'm working on, then we can't possibly make that shift to make meaning. We just suffer because we don't know why we're suffering. We don't know that there's a bigger plan. We're not part of that fabric of being, that Indra's net. We're not part of the hive. And so sometimes it's not that easy to feel connected. And I realize that, at least from my own experience. Sometimes it's impossible to feel that we're connected. So there are ways to listen. And so I want to suggest some of those ways. Before I do that, I just want to say about the suffering that this is an initiatory experience when we're suffering. And if we go into the suffering unconsciously, that's okay. But the idea is that at some point, we are going to have to come to some kind of consciousness in order to be able to continue on the journey. And of course, in the shamanic initiate's journey, in the descent of Inanna, and also you'll recognize echoes of this story in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, all of these require us to meet the gatekeepers, to surrender to what's happening there, just like Inanna having to give up a piece of herself with each piece that goes along. The initiate, he has to battle the demons and the dragon. And ultimately, the only way that any of us can return home from that underworld journey is to be able to give ourselves up, to give something of ourselves up. And when I say that, I mean, of course, the ego self, right? So that ego is the navigator in our human lives. It's the one that gets us around. It gets us to appointments on time or not sometimes, depending on what's going on with your ego. It's the one that has desires and passions, and it's the one that helps us to, pay the bills and do the work that we need to do. But the challenge is that it thinks it's the only game in town. It doesn't give any consciousness to the soul self. And I always like to say that the ego is kind of like a limo driver who's driving around and has no idea, because the divider is up, has no idea that there's somebody in the back seat that actually has a GPS that can give the instructions on where we need to go and what the destination is. Turn right at this stoplight, turn left over there. And instead, that divider is up. And so we're not listening. We don't know that that soul self has even the capacity, that it even exists, that it has the capacity. And so, yeah, it's a descent and it's difficult, and we have to surrender through each one of those. And I remember a mentor saying to me once, you know, I was working on a problem, a specific issue, and she said to me, she said, you know, you can walk away from that situation, or you can turn a blind eye to it, or, you know, whatever you want to do to avoid it. And you can go over here and get a new situation. You could go get a new job or a new relationship or a new, you know, situation over here. But she said, the common denominator is always going to be you. You are the one who's working on the stuff that you came here to work on, and it's going to be given to you in whatever situation you show up to be in. And so that has stuck with me. In fact, that was very pivotal for me in my life, because I started to realize that there are things that I need and want to learn. That's part of my whole plan coming in. We each have that blueprint that is our soul self, the soul's code, as James Hillman called it. You know, he said that that mighty oak tree was all contained in that tiny little acorn. And of course, we all have that as well. So Mary Oliver, the poet, said, "Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift." And I love that quote because it is true. You know, as we look back on our journeys after having gone through them, we can begin to see that each one of the challenges that we met, each one of the struggles that we found and overcame, each one of those gatekeepers or those demons that we battled, each one of them had medicine for us. And that's medicine in the indigenous sense, right? It was something for our soul's growth. And when we're able to look at it from that perspective, we begin to understand that everyone we meet on the path is our teacher, and every situation that comes along is an invitation. And that certainly has been the case for all of us, I think. In fact, this year of COVID so far, I recognized that for myself early on, that this was an invitation. And various people did various things with that invitation. You know, I would have loved to have written a book during that time, or because I know some people who did, or to, you know, have accomplished things, or to have had time to just sit in the garden, or whatever it was. Of course, the grass is always greener, but I also recognized that with each challenge, with each piece of bad news, with all of the suffering that I was so aware of in others people's lives and all the challenges that I felt I was facing, there's also a doorway there. There's something here for me. And I think as a society, there's something here for us. And it doesn't mean that people aren't suffering, but it means that there is an opportunity to make meaning of this suffering. So I want to ask you, you know, what is calling to you? And if you don't know what's calling to you, how do you figure it out? How do you know what's calling to you? And the analyst, Jungian analyst Yolanda Jacoby, captures this really beautifully. She says, like a seed growing into a tree, life unfolds stage by stage. Triumphant ascent, collapse, crises, failures, and new beginnings strew the way. It is the path trodden by the great majority of mankind, as a rule unreflectingly, unconsciously, unsuspectingly, following its labyrinthine windings from birth to death in hope and longing. It is hedged about with struggle and suffering, joy and sorrow, guilt and error, and nowhere is there security from catastrophe. And yet, that end quote for her, and yet we know that we are connected to something bigger if only we can hear. and then follow the soul's call. So how do we listen? There's a million ways. If you're into depth psychology, it becomes a lot easier because for me, at least, the ways are really obvious. And I'm just going to give you a list of a few here in case you're wondering. And if you already do some of these things, it might be really beautiful for you to just ponder and feel into yourself what it feels like when you do any one of these things. And the first one that absolutely has to happen is you have to make space in life to slow down. You have to make the space to be able to hear the soul's calling with all the chaos and noise that's in the world and in our lives, and with us doing and doing and doing, because that's what our culture asks of us. There is not enough space for us to slow down. And Jung tells a great story. I love the story and I tell it all the time. And that is that when he was traveling in Africa, cars were still fairly new at the time. And not very many villagers in Africa had seen a car. And Jung was traveling with some other people going from one village to the next. And they invited a villager to go with them in the car for the very first time. And so they started driving. And as they got about 30 minutes down the road, the villager suddenly said, "Stop the car, stop the car." And they said, why, what's wrong? And they stopped the car, and the villager jumped out and laid down on the ground, and they said, "Are you feeling okay?" And he said, yes, I'm okay. The car was going so fast, I had to wait for my soul to catch up. So let that sit with you for just a moment. I don't know if you feel like that. I have definitely felt like that at times in my life. And I always say to my students and clients that it's so important that we stop the car and listen. So if you feel compelled to be working all the time, or busy all the time, or distracted all the time, please, 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 and it's your soul begging to you, just see if you can't find a time to sit in the garden, to walk in nature, to work with your dreams, to journal. Can you spend time in water if you're near water? Can you do breath work or just pay attention to your breathing? Can you get into your body in some way, whether it's yoga or stretching or running or dancing? You cannot do this without including the physical body. And that is probably the biggest lesson that I have learned. We have to include the body. The body is actually the repository of everything that we need to know. And it is the gateway to intuition and the gateway to hearing our soul's call. So this was a big one for me. And because we live in a very head-centered culture, I think it might be big for a lot of people. Listening to the ancestors, making ritual, making art. As you do each one of these things, you will gain more of a felt sense of being in the world. And you will begin to be able to feel the difference between being in your head and being in the present moment. In our head, we only know the past, which may or may not be the way that we remember it, or we think about the future, which hasn't even happened yet. But when we drop into our bodies and in the present moment, we begin to notice synchronicities. I call them breadcrumbs from the soul. When you start to see synchronicities happening, it's the soul reflecting back to us that we are absolutely on the right track. And then if you can enter into a dialogue with what's happening, with what you're encountering in the world around you. You know, Jung always said, and Hillman, you know, I don't know if I'm in the world or if the world is in me. I don't know if the soul's in me or if I'm in the soul. If we look at the world around us as alive and intelligent and ensouled, and we notice that it's all part of that one consciousness, what Jung called the unus mundus, we all come from the same source and we're here living our lives. And if we do it consciously, we are beaming back our experience to the divine, to the sacred, to the greatest soul self, so that that divine can learn and grow also. If we're not conscious about what's happening, then we lose that capacity to be able to make meaning in our lives. So I just want to wrap up here with a couple of quotes. One, Rumi says, "Sometimes you hear a voice through the door calling you, as fish out of water hear the waves, or a hunting falcon hears the drums." come back. And Frederick Buechner, who was an American poet and theologian, says, listen to your life. See it for the fathomless mystery it is, in the boredom and pain of it, no less than in the excitement and gladness. Touch, taste, smell your way to the holy and hidden heart of it, because in the last analysis, all moments are key moments, and life itself is grace. So I just want to invite you, if you are interested in working with soul, please reach out to me. I can point you in directions. I can give you ideas. I've just launched a training program for those who would like to help other people to find their way back to soul. So if you've been on that journey and found the treasure and it's time to give back to the community, that's an option for you as well. Thank you, everybody. I wish you the most amazing new year with lots of love and light and consciousness.